In this video tutorial we're going to look at the sampler, one of the instruments that comes with Ableton. First thing we're going to do is insert it into a MIDI track. So we select Instruments and copy the sampler over into that MIDI track. The default screen is very similar to the simpler in that we have one section to drag a sample in, and we have some parameters that we can control underneath. We also then have some tabs at the top, which we'll look into shortly. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag a sample in, and for the purpose of this I'm just going to use drum samples. So I'm going to go into my user sample library, select my one-shot multi-sample drums, and I've got some bass drums in this folder. The number corresponds with the velocity that they've been struck at. So I'm going to create a multi-velocity key mapped drum kit. So I'm going to take my bass drum 1 and drag it into my sample. You can see the waveform. If you have silence at the beginning, you can adjust the start position. In this case I might just ever so slightly. If I need to zoom in, if I hover above in the black, so the greyed out black bar, I can zoom in and I can just drag this right to the beginning of my sample. When I press a key on my MIDI keyboard, I can hear the sound. By default, the sampler sets its root key to C3, so that means when I press C3 it plays the sample back at its original pitch. However, if I then play other notes, going up the scale and down the scale. So if we're using a percussive instrument, the root key isn't as important as if we were sampling a melodic instrument. If we've recorded an E on a violin, we would want to set the root key to E, and so on and so forth. If we select Zone from the tabs, we open up a new dialog box. This gives us the name of the sample that we are using, and its default view is key mapping. So this green area here, this green bar, this sets the keys that will trigger the sample back, and there's a very small R which sets the root key. So what I'm going to do for this bass drum is set it so that it will only play on C3. If I click and drag the end all the way up to C3, same with the other end. So now when I press C3 I get sound, but every other key, no sound. I'm now going to add a medium velocity drum kit, bass drum. So I'm going to drag it straight into this grey area here. By default it changes the view in the sampler itself, and it's assigned a new sample with a full key range. So I'm going to drag this and put this on C3 as well. Now when I press the key C3, both samples are being heard simultaneously. That's because we've not told which one to play at which velocity. I'm going to just drag in bass drum number 9, set the key mapping to C3, and now we can adjust the velocities for the resamples. So from these options here, we're going to select Vel for velocity, and 1 through to 127 corresponds with the velocity that the key will be played at. So I'm going to divide these into 3 fairly equal parts. So 0 to 44 for the low velocity hit, from 45 up to 90, and then for the high velocity bass drum 9 from 91 all the way up to 127. And it's important to make sure that the numbers end and start consecutively and don't overlap. So what we can see when I press a key, we'll see a little red bar appear, and this indicates the velocity that we're playing the key at. So if I play the key lightly, sorry it's turquoise not red, if I play it slightly harder and then harder again, so what's actually happening when the key is being struck anywhere between 0 and 44, I think we had it, then it's playing this sample, bass drum 1. Louder plays bass drum 2, and louder again plays bass drum 3. So that's the bass drum key mapped and the velocities controlled. So now let's do exactly the same for a snare. So we're going to drag snare 1 in, snare 6 and snare 12 for our different velocities. Now this time we want the snare to trigger from a different key, not C3. So I'm going to change its root key to D3. I'm going to do that for all 3 of my snares. That means that when I press D3 on the keyboard, it will play the snare at the pitch that it was recorded at. Going back into key, I'm going to set my key mapping so that it only plays back on D3. I'm also going to change the velocities, so I'll keep it fairly similar to how we had the bass drum. So up to 44, 45 up to 90, and then 91 plus. So I have my bass drum, and now I have a snare drum. And you can hear the difference in the snare drum a bit clearer than you can on the bass drum. That's the process of multi-sampling and key mapping with a percussive instrument.